OODA informing your decisions with intelligence, analysis, and insight. Brought to you by the team at OODALoop.com.
Hello and welcome. On this OODA we have Dan Gerstein. Dan is a noted technologist, author of multiple books, PhD in biodefense, very timely for this point in our collective history. He's currently a senior researcher with RAND, but has spent a career in technology leadership and organizational leadership, including after graduating from West Point, a career in the Army where he served on multiple continents, supporting multiple missions from humanitarian ops to combat to preventing weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, to policy making. And after a career in the Army, spent some time in industry, returned to government as a senior executive leading Department of Defense policy for countering weapons of mass destruction, and then senior leadership positions in the Department of Homeland Security, where he led the approach of DHS towards S&T, science and technology research, not just for that department, but for the nation in these key DHS S&T mission areas, and then was acting undersecretary for a while. And it's a real honor to talk with you today, Dan.
Well, thanks, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Well, and I really appreciate it. And one of the first questions I wanted to ask, Dan, is what did I miss from your bio, and did I get any of that wrong? I did, I should say, in looking over your bio, a lot of education, self-education and writing. You have 3 master's degrees, including a master's degree in engineering, along with that PhD.
Well, as you pointed out, I come from a military background, and one of the things about the U.S. Army is that they really do believe in education. And so they sent me to get 3 of those master's degrees. And that's been a great experience. And they also sent me in different curricula, which is very interesting. So, I think that, I put myself through a PhD program after I retired from the Army. But, I'm a firm believer in lifelong learning and trying to continue to understand this very complex world that we live in.
That's cool. And I also notice, I assume you're a firm believer in lifelong writing just because of you've been so prolific. But I wanted to mention, I mean, how much of that did you do while you were in uniform in the Army? Were you writing back then as well?
So I was very fortunate. The Army sent me to go to the Council on Foreign Relations as a military fellow after my brigade command. And in that year, I had the opportunity to think and write. And I actually did my first book while I was on active duty. I followed it up with 2 other books before leaving active duty. One of them happens to be called Assignment Pentagon, which I was, at least qualified by time in the Pentagon to write. But so I had 3 books done before I left the active duty.
That's great. That's fantastic. We were talking a little bit about, my service was Navy, yours was Army, but I was very privileged to be extremely joint and got to work with some great leaders from the Army, some of my best bosses. I did run into one boss, however, who was Army, who told me, I wanted to write also. And I wrote a few articles and I had a couple published. And this crusty old Army colonel, intelligence officer looked at me and said, if you've got time enough to write, you must not be doing your job. And I thought, okay, there's 2 different kinds of leaders you run into, and that's not the one I aspired to be.
Well, there's a funny thing about writing, and I'll just very quickly share this with you, and that is that, when I get a topic that I'm really interested in, I sort of put myself on a schedule. And so I normally wake up at, 4 in the morning on Saturday and Sunday, and I will devote myself to kind of working the morning hours. And, pretty soon, once you've kind of done this and put pen to paper, you have a book. And so it's a matter of sitting down and forcing yourself to put your ideas on paper.
Do you find that writing also forces you to think and learn new things?
Oh, it absolutely does. For each of the books, and in particular, the most recent one, The Story of Technology, How We Got Here and What the Future Holds. I did, just a tremendous amount of learning through that process, trying to come up with examples that would cause the reader to better understand the technology systems of today and how important they are to humanity. So yeah, I think it really is. It's very much a learning process.
That's cool. And I sure learned reading your book. And I have a couple other questions I think will flow from that. And of course, I want to get to the current crisis too. You're very well positioned to give us some context on that. But one of the things that jumped out at me early on at the book is the way you described yourself. I think you said something like, you're a bit of an accidental technologist. And when I read that and how you're reading it, I thought, hey, wait, maybe he's talking about me too. I didn't come into this to be a computer scientist. I was an operator and an intel guy and an enthusiast. And so maybe I'm going to start using that phrase myself, accidental technologist.
Well, for me, I was an operator. I spent many years in the Army. I was, in forward deployed positions. And my time was trying to put communications networks in very austere places around the world. So it was, by its very nature, highly technical. But over time, I wound up not only just thinking about the communications networks, but also big data and how do you make sense of all the information that's coming at you. And so little by little, I went from being a user of technology to managing lower level technology systems to, running, it was $1 billion organization. We had laboratories that did high containment for biological and chemical components and agents. So, it sort of grew into this, and that's why I call myself the accidental technologist.
Cool. Yeah, I love the way you put that. Another kind of key theme that I noticed from the book. Now, first of all, it's an exciting and fast book. It moves about as fast as the pace of technology, frankly. So it's a very good read. And also, you don't have to have a PhD to learn from this book. It was all, to me, written in plain English and very understandable. So I like that about it. But another theme I noticed just woven throughout it is how everything has become so connected. And, benefits and progress in one area cause benefits and progress in another area. And it's not just little niches or stovepipes of separate technologies anymore. It's really all interconnected. Did I take the right thing away from the book?
Oh, absolutely. We call it convergence, of course. And, you can take just about any system and look at the lineage of these systems and find the smallest of technologies embedded in all of them. Just take aircraft, for example. Today's aircraft use exactly the same physical properties as the Wright brothers used in understanding the lift that they needed to generate, and therefore the speed over the wings that would cause the plane to become airborne. And we use the same kinds of concepts. They had a steering control, which was actually their first patent. And what's interesting about that is that while it's very rudimentary by today's standards, the same physical principles apply. And so, there is this DNA of technology, and we see it in all of our different technologies.
Yeah, that's neat. Well, so this leads to the next kind of question. Now, another thing that you've noted in the book, and we have all observed, it used to be U.S. government R&D and needs in demand generation were a driving force, not just in national security technology, but all technology. It was the government spending money to really accelerate stuff. And now, of course, it's no longer the case and hasn't been the case for 20 years. And it's even harder now for the government to really steer what corporate worlds are doing in their R&D spending. So I want to talk about this dynamic of how can governments influence the future of technology? Or you tell me, please, if that's the wrong question, how can citizens steer the future of technology? It used to be that citizens would do that through their government. There's regulations and taxation and spending of R&D budgets. But now what are our options? If the government has far less influence on the development of technology, what do we citizens do to make sure we get the outcomes we want? Any thoughts on that, Dan?
Yeah, if I can though, let me go back to a little bit of, the R&D system that we built, the research and development system. And, if you go back to the end of World War II, we started this system based on the lessons that we'd learned. And it grew to 1960, the government spent 65% of all research and development dollars, leaving industry and academia spending 35%. Now today, it's completely inverted. Today, academia plus industry now spend about 75% of all R&D dollars, and the government only 24%. And what that means is that the government doesn't have the same pull that it once had. You look at a lot of the technologies that were developed, they came out of programs, a space program, they came out of military programs. Global positioning system is an example. The internet is another example. And today, what we're seeing is completely flipped. The R&D dollars are in different places, and the demand is actually from society. When you look at the information age, you're seeing society pull forward information technologies. And that, I think, is a real interesting concept. It means the government has to be a better consumer. There's one other trend, and that is the global trend. In the 1960s, the US spent 70% of all R&D around the world. And today, the government, or the US, still has the lead, but we are about 500 billion a year, whereas China is about 410 billion a year, and they are catching up, and others around the world are catching up too. So it's really something to think about as technology becomes more democratized, more available across the globe.
Right. And, another key point here I want to ask your thoughts on. So not only is it global like this, and not only is the U.S. government spending less on R&D and is now having less influence, but does anyone have any influence on where this technology is going? Like, let's say somebody in a lab somewhere comes up with a better chip architecture and says, hey, this is a better way to do compute on chips. Why would that have any influence on the direction of our current architecture? Those decisions are made by, markets. And that's just one example. No one entity has control over this. No one government has control over it. No coalition of governments seems to have control over it. Who is driving the future of technology?
So I'd say the two big drivers are CEOs and the shareholders. We are looking for profits, corporately, and so there's a lot of drive that comes from that. What's also interesting is the government still tries to control technologies, things like export controls or national laws that would prohibit certain behaviors. But on the other hand, many of those are becoming antiquated because they haven't kept up with the pace of technology. Imagine we have a patent system where we grant patents for 20 years, but yet information technologies are changing every 18 months. So does it still make sense? And I'm not saying we should get rid of patent laws, but we should reconsider what it really means to have a patent in a system that is moving so rapidly.
Fascinating. And, I also noticed you had written about government attempts to steer encryption. For example, the FBI Apple debates, and that is still going on today. And and it's not just our government, it's governments who want to be able to say, here's, what we want. We want a backdoor into the systems. While other technologists are saying, that's exactly what we don't want. It will do more harm than good. It's the wrong question. And so these are key issues. And that's an example of thousands that we need informed people to weigh in on and help us come to the right conclusion.
Yeah, what's interesting about the Apple FBI standoff, it occurred right after the San Bernardino terrorist shootings. And it's also been resurrected here over the last couple months with respect to the shootings down at Pensacola Air Force Base or Naval Base. And the interesting thing about this is that you are seeing industry essentially trying to change laws that have evolved over, a couple hundred years. The privacy laws, for example. We don't have absolute privacy in anything in our daily lives. If there's a court order, if law enforcement wants to come into your home based on legal justification, they can do so. But in the case of the Apple FBI standoff, the Apple CEO has essentially said, we don't care about previous case law. We don't want to have a back door. And so I think that government has to step in and really think about where the limits are. I'm not arguing one side or the other. I think it's a valid point that Apple makes, but I also think it's a valid point that the government, under certain legal frameworks, ought to be able to come in and do searches and seizures.
Right. Fascinating. And I want to mention one other quick anecdote. Personally happened to me about 4 years ago. I'm up at a conference about 2 hours from home, and I get a text from my wife, and she says essentially, don't worry, hon, everything is okay, but there's an escaped murderer loose in the neighborhood, and nobody knows where he is. So, of course, I worry. And, of course, I rush right home and try to get all the information I can. And by the time I get here, the neighborhood is all surrounded by police. And this neighborhood where we're normally so concerned about our privacy is welcoming the police in. And we love it that a drone is flying overhead. And, every door is open to the police. Yes, come in, look around, whatever you want to see. You just come on in. And then that crisis was over and it was resolved and they found the guy. And then it's back to our, the walls are up, the doors are up. No police are coming in here without a warrant. And now, I'm thinking about this current crisis, and I want to return to that in more detail later. But now I'm like, hey, wait a second. Maybe we should automatically turn on the tracking in all of our devices to understand where every human has been. And then if they were exposed to the virus, we know who they may have run into. And if they weren't exposed to the virus, we'll be able to send them an alert and say, you need to self-quarantine for a while. And that kind of invasion of privacy, I never would have wanted or supported ever. And I'm thinking thoughts like this. So I guess I would appreciate your thoughts on that. Do times change? Do attitudes change? And what happens when the crisis passes? How do we get our freedoms and privacy back?
Yeah, look, technology is presenting very interesting trade-offs. So let me give you one on genomics. So if I told you that I want your genome and I'd like to be able to bring it in and put it into a database and store it with 327 million other Americans' genomes so that we could help you with personalized medicine, that would be interesting to you probably, because we could probably find ways to be able to relate a genotype, that is the gene sequence, with a phenotype, that is the observable characteristics, what causes disease, etc. But if I then tell you, hey, wait, I'm going to take that genomic data and I'm going to correlate it, I'm going to find out how honest you are. Maybe there are certain parts of the genome that are able to tell the likelihood that somebody may be deceptive, or perhaps be able to say that they're susceptible to this disease, so they're not insurable. Those are things that I think most of us would recoil from, but yet the offer of personalized medicine is very interesting.
Right, yeah. So these are great challenges and topics to talk about. And before getting to the current crisis, I have one other thing I really would appreciate your input on, and that is, what do we teach our kids today? That's a broad subject, and every kid is different. Every family's in a different situation. But if you're thinking about advice that you might personally give to parents of a young child, and these parents want this child to have a great future, what should they be encouraging a very young child to learn? Should it be the sciences, the arts? And then the same kind of question for an older person. Maybe it's a high school student. What would you tell her or him to consider as they select the curriculum that they're going to study in high school and then in college in order to be successful in this fast-moving, technologically oriented world?
Well, we are already seeing some real challenges with respect to the mismatch between our educational needs as a society and where students are going in terms of their curricula. And we need to really think hard about this. When we talk about artificial intelligence and we think about the future of work, and we say, will there still be opportunities for work? You know, the fact is that many of the jobs, if it's a repetitive job, if it is something that doesn't require much higher order thinking, that it's sort of, you go from task to task, those are jobs that we are very likely going to see automated and, if you will, offloaded to artificial intelligence and robots. So where we need people are algorithm developers and big data scientists and people who understand biology and nanotechnology and, you know, all of the other different areas that are beginning to mature. So it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have people with a broad liberal education. In fact, I would argue that if you're working on a scientific and technological team or technology team, that you are better served to have a combination of people. For example, you know, it's helpful to have a biologist looking at a cybersecurity problem. There are a lot of relationships between the way an infected computer looks and an infected individual looks. And so, you know, having this cross-fertilization can be useful. It's also useful, we talked about a case where ethics is important. So having a broad understanding of the law, of ethical left and right limits can also be important when we're doing cybersecurity initiatives. So I'm a real fan of broad-based education. At some point, people obviously go to what they're interested in, but I think a foundation of math and science, of the STEM education is very important. And then later on, I think it's fine to broaden out, but a broad liberal education that covers the humanities and the sciences and math is invaluable and will become even more so in the AI-enabled future.
Thanks. I really appreciate that, especially after reading your most recent book, because I think that makes a lot of sense. You know, this technology is going to keep moving faster and faster, and we're going to need our future leaders to understand both the technology, but also the art and the beauty and how it all fits together and how it's converging and how we can better serve humanity. So thanks. That's good context. And speaking of education, PhD in biodefense. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And I would, now that was after your time in the military. Meanwhile, in the military, you had also worked on some biodefense activities. And I thought I'd ask this as a segue into discussions about the current crisis. So what was your PhD about?
Well, right after the Amerithrax attacks in 2001, that was right after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, there was an anthrax attack and allegedly perpetrated by a scientist from the Army laboratory at Fort Detrick. He committed suicide before we were able to determine whether or not he was the perpetrator. But that essentially caused an entire field to grow up, and the field was biodefense. And so the curriculum that I took was at George Mason University. It entailed hard science courses. I hadn't taken it for almost 30 years. I took bacteriology, I took virology, I took aerobiology, emergency management, arms control courses, all of it coming together into this one course. And you know, that was a really terrific opportunity to meld, as I spoke before, the sciences and the humanities and the more technical with the more philosophical. So that's where I got my PhD from.
Great, thanks. It's good context, and I think a good segue to your perspective on this current crisis. I think everybody that I know and have been interacting with has been keeping themselves informed and are reading the latest from the CDC and watching the news and watching what experts are saying and tracking how serious this is, and know it's not going to go away quickly, and know that we need to do things like practice good social distancing and change our behaviors and wash our hands frequently, and hopefully as the government ramps up testing, we'll see some progress in understanding what's really happening. But I think we're also all aware that there's no instantaneous vaccine, even though that is being sped up incredibly. Speeding it up incredibly still means perhaps a year to 18 months. And tracking treatments, it looks like there's a lot of research going on potential treatments that can make things better. But right now, no silver bullet, and a lot of data needs to be collected and found before there's any sort of treatment. And that's seems to be kind of where we're at. Would you agree is that the current situation?
I think it is the current situation, but I think there's one more data point that's worthy of consideration. And that is, if you look at how fast this is moving, we are in a very frightening place. It took about 67 days for the first 100,000 cases to be identified. It took 11 days later until we had 200,000 cases. It took 4 days later until we had 300,000 cases. And it's now about 2 or 3 days where we are over 400,000 cases. I would estimate by the end of today or early tomorrow, we'll probably have 500,000 cases identified worldwide. And that is very frightening. That says that it's in the exponential phase, and we are nowhere near being able to control the virus at this point. We do know that the only measures that are going to work are the social distancing, the self-isolation if you've been exposed, quarantines if necessary, but those sorts of very difficult measures will be required so that we can stop the transmission of this virus.
Right. Very scary, very serious, and very important. And I appreciate your context on that. So there's things that we can do as individuals, and you've just mentioned several of them: the social distancing to protect yourself, your family. What else can governments do to help protect us?
Well, this is really a two-part answer. It's first, what should have governments been doing to protect us? Because there are preparatory things that could have been done. And now there's the response part of it, which are things that government needs to do to better coordinate. And so I won't spend a lot of time on the preparedness, but I think it's important to say that if you think about technology as being more broad than just the individual piece of equipment or tool or whatever, and you think about the definition of technology really comes from the derivation that means craft or craftsmanship, and that implies how one does things. And so training and exercises are extremely important so that governments and industries and even private citizens are prepared. And we can tell that we have slipped in our preparedness. We are not giving coherent messages to the populations, which is also important. And, frankly, this lack of clarity has been very much at the heart of why in the United States, we are almost at 60,000 infected that we have tested and confirmed today. And that's, again, very frightening. Now, what can we do in terms of a response? Well, the diagnostics are key, and everybody's picking up on that. We do have diagnostics, but they're not what is necessarily needed. These are diagnostics that have to be conducted. You take a sample, you bring it back to a lab. They take 2, 3, 4, 5 days in order to get the results back. That's a problem. When I was in DHS, we were trying to develop real-time point-of-care diagnostics so that you could literally give someone the test, and almost like a pregnancy test, you would know in a very short order. And that's the kind of testing that we really need. It needs to be cheap, it needs to be very efficient, and very specific to the pathogen that we're concerned about. And so that's not available now. There's another type of testing that we really need, and that's being worked on also, and that is serological testing. What this means is, whereas the first test is looking for an active infection, in other words, is there active virus in the patient, the serological testing is looking for a previous infection. It's looking for antibodies. That would help us determine who's actually infected, or who has been infected and is now immune. So those people could theoretically get back to work if they had a strong enough immune response. And that would be beneficial for the economy.
Right. Fascinating. Great context. And I do want to move on to another technological and related subject, but first wanted to ask if you had other thoughts to share about the current crisis that we didn't cover.
This crisis is unlike any that we've ever faced. You know, a lot of people after 9/11 looked at the terrorist threat and considered it to be existential. I have a friend who has put out, he said, you know, I'm a counterterrorism guy. I have looked at this problem for 20 years and considered it to be existential. I did not know what existential was until this pandemic hit. And I think that's a context that we all need to think about. This is probably the most significant threat that this generation will face. And we need to think very hard about our preparedness and our response capabilities for biological attacks, if they were man-made, or Mother Nature, who is quite a bioterrorist in and of herself. We need to be prepared for either of those, and we're seeing this play out now.
Dan, that is so very well put. Thank you. And you also made me think of my business partner, Matt DeVoe, who, as this started to go, you know, Matt DeVoe, by the way, is a long-term risk management professional with deep credentials in this field. And the way he put it to me was he had long considered 9/11 to be the defining event of his life. And now he realizes that it's not, that it is this current crisis is the defining event of his life. And as he said that, and I realized that, yes, that applies to me, but it's going to apply to 7 billion people around the globe. We're all going to share this defining event of our life and get through it. Which,
that is correct.
You know, which leads to something else I'd really like your context on, and that is basically, could you believe or could you imagine dealing with this if we did not have the internet? I know you remember a time before the internet existed, but if you think of that time and now think of today, where the internet connects every city in the globe, almost every person in the globe can access it and can share information. And when it comes to this crisis, we were able to see it as it evolved in China, even though they tried to restrict and censor, and we were able to see what happened there. And medical researchers, even in China with that censorship, were able to get information out, including information on the genetic sequence of the virus. So researchers around the globe could start working on that. And now that's repeated in every other country. As people see this and start learn lessons, they can instantly share it because of the internet. And that also includes sharing best practices. We've all seen what Singapore did and what South Korea did and what Japan did. So we can learn best practices and we can learn worst practices. And we can see the horrible deaths that are occurring in places and learn that from the internet too. So, you know, technology, especially the internet, is playing a key role in helping humanity deal with this, and would love your perspective on that.
Well, I think you laid out the positive piece of the internet very well. I think the internet is just an extraordinary tool. I think what we are having some difficulty with today is understanding what's real and what's not real on the internet. So there are a lot of bad, if you will, solutions that have been put on the internet. And it's not just for this crisis. I mean, we've seen it with respect to elections. We've seen it with respect to polarization in the political climate. And, you know, it's something that we have to understand about the internet. And we have to be able to manage it far better than we do. I have been somewhat appalled, like, and this is a little off what you directly asked, but when Mark Zuckerberg came and was talking about, what would be pulled down off of Facebook, it's kind of interesting that he had a different approach than other social media, and his was much more liberal about allowing things, even if we knew they were incorrect, to remain on there. So I think you have to be very careful about what you consume and how you consume internet traffic, so that you go to those sites and you follow those sites that are giving you good information. Look, I use the internet tremendously. I think there are websites out there. You go to the CDC website on biological incidents like this, and they have absolutely terrific information. But you can also find in some of the chat rooms, you can find things that don't fit very well, like the people who are against vaccines, despite years of understanding of the relationship between vaccines and halting spread of disease. So, we just need to be careful about how we consume and where we consume our information.
Great, thanks. And you remind me, there's you're at Rand. There's another Rand thought leader there who published a book. I think it was called Truth Decay. So I know you guys have been working in this field pretty extensively. And Dan, as we move to the final question, I wanted to say I do have your bio online. I'm going to share that in the links to this and point people to that, which also includes a list of many of your publications and a list of many of the articles that you've been writing. So I'm going to share that with our viewers. But I wanted to return to your book as a kind of a closing question. And that is, it's a great book. It's a very fast book that shares history, what's going on today, and then projections out into the future. I wanted to ask, though, in the context of this current crisis, are there things that you would have written differently or would have projected differently, or that this crisis would have caused you to change in any way? Or does it just underscore the importance of all of us thinking through where technology can take us?
So I got done with the book, and publishing a book is a fairly long process. And in the intervening time, there were things that I wanted to say that I didn't yet put into this book. And so I'm a slow learner. I've got another book on technology that I'm working on, which I call Tech Wars. And so what I'm fascinated by is that, I think we're in the middle of a technology war. And it's being waged throughout the globe. It's for, having primacy in certain technologies. Some of these are just game changing. And so what I am very interested in and focused on are these ways in which we're going to navigate this very difficult period when humanity has never had more capacity to do harm to itself. Yet, we don't have governments that are in control and thinking about these problems. We only see governments react once the harm has actually been seen. You see it with drones, in which aircraft have almost been taken out of the sky. Commercial aircraft have almost been taken out of the sky, hitting a drone. You see drones landing in front of national leaders who are standing on stage giving speeches. Those kinds of things are harm, but yet they weren't regulated until we saw that harm. And I worry today that with capabilities such as biotechnology that allows us to manipulate the genome, with the Internet of Things, which has creeped into our daily lives, and with artificial intelligence, if you see the link up of these three, we are liable to see a very changed humanity as we look to the future. And so I'm very interested in a humanity that is, if you will, that is, good for humans, not just one in which we are sort of become the subjects of our technologies.
Great. Thanks, Dan, for that. And thanks for all this other context on these wide-ranging technological issues. I really appreciate it.
Happy to do it, and thanks for having me.
All right. Well, thanks, Dan.
Thanks for listening to this OODA Loop production. For the latest analysis on cybersecurity, technology, and global risks, please visit www.oodaloop.com.